In the spring of 1945, somewhere in the ruins of Frankfurt, a 20-year-old Jewish refugee stood face to face with a two-star SS general who clicked his heels and snapped to attention. The general's uniform was immaculate despite the chaos outside. The young man wore the insignia of a PFC, Private First Class, the lowest rank that could give orders. Between them hung a question that neither would speak aloud. Who had really won? Frank Cohn adjusted the U.S. armband on his sleeve and opened his mouth to begin the interrogation. But his hand trembled slightly as he gripped his notepad, because 6 years earlier, this same uniform would have marked him for death in the country where he was born. Before we discover what happened in that interrogation room, tell us where you're watching from. Whether you're in Berlin or Boston, São Paulo or Sydney, we'd love to know where our community of history lovers is tuning in today. Drop your location in the comments below. Frank had learned to hide his trembling hands early. Back in Breslau, when he was 6 years old, his mother had gripped his wrist so tightly it hurt as Nazi stormtroopers marched past their sporting goods store. The signs they carried said things a child shouldn't have to read. Don't buy from Jews. Jews are Germany's misfortune. Mama, why do they hate us? Frank had whispered. His mother didn't answer. She just held his hand tighter and pulled him inside. 2 weeks later, his father sold the store. Frank didn't understand why until years later his father had seen what was coming. The family's savings dwindled. His mother stopped buying him new shoes. And then came the news that made the adults whisper in corners Uncle Herman was dead. The stormtroopers had found him in Chemnitz. It was an accident, Frank's aunt said, her voice hollow. It was murder, his father said quietly, when he thought Frank couldn't hear. Frank was 6 years old and he understood perfectly. The Nazis were the enemy. By October 1938, his mother had made arrangements Frank knew nothing about. She woke him at 5 in the morning, pressed a finger to her lips, and led him out of their apartment like thieves fleeing a crime scene. They carried 1 suitcase and 10 marks, all the law allowed. On the train to Berlin, Frank watched Germany disappear through the window. His mother sat rigid, her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask. At the Berlin station, she said goodbye to Frank's grandfather. The old man held her for a long time. "I'll see you soon, Papa," she whispered. Frank's grandfather smiled, but his eyes were wet. "Yes, my darling, soon." Frank never saw him again. None of them did. The steamship Statendam was a floating palace. Frank had never seen anything like it. White tablecloths, crystal glasses, stewards in crisp uniforms. For 2 weeks, he ate food he couldn't pronounce and slept in a bed that didn't smell like fear. "Mama, are we rich now?" he asked. His mother laughed, but it sounded like crying. "No, my love. We're just very, very lucky." They arrived in New York on October 30th, 1938. 10 days later, on November 9th, the Nazis unleashed Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Every synagogue in Germany burned. Every Jewish-owned shop was smashed. Every Jewish man the Nazis could find was arrested. Frank's mother read the newspaper with shaking hands. "We got out," she whispered. "We got out just in time." But Frank felt something else stirring in his chest. Not relief, not gratitude, rage. Frank was 16 when someone ran past his apartment building shouting, "The Japs just bombed Pearl Harbor." "Where's Pearl Harbor?" Frank asked. Nobody knew, but within hours everyone understood. America was at war. Frank felt a fierce joy rising in his chest. England had been fighting alone for too long. Now, with America in the fight, Germany would fall. He was certain of it. "This doesn't concern you," his mother said firmly. "You're only 16. By the time you're old enough, it'll be over." But the war didn't end. It spread like fire across the world, and Frank realized with growing certainty that he would be part of it. He volunteered as an air raid warden messenger, too young to be a full warden, but old enough to help. He ran through blacked-out streets delivering messages, feeling useful, feeling American. On his 18th birthday in August 1943, Frank enrolled in one college course. In September, the draft notice arrived. His mother cried. Frank didn't. At Fort Dix, New Jersey, the reception center processed hundreds of young men every day. Frank stood in lines, filled out forms, received uniforms and dog tags. On the second day, they woke him at 4 in the morning for KP duty, kitchen patrol. He peeled potatoes until his hands cramped and scrubbed pots until his back ached. "This is the army," he muttered to himself. "He'd better get used to it." On the fourth day, everyone received orders for basic training, everyone except Frank. He ran to the sergeant's desk. "Sir, everyone's leaving. What about me?" The sergeant frowned and checked his papers. "Oh, right. You're an enemy alien." Frank felt the floor tilt beneath him. "I'm a what?" "Enemy alien. You came on a visitor's visa, never got naturalized. Born in Germany, last passport was German. The FBI has to investigate you." "But I'm not the enemy," Frank's voice cracked. "I'm here to fight the enemy." The sergeant shrugged. "Not my call, kid. You'll be here a while. Hope you like KP." Frank walked back to his bunk in a daze. An enemy alien. After everything, after fleeing Germany, after losing his grandfather, after volunteering the moment he could, they thought he was the enemy. That night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Around him, other recruits snored and muttered in their sleep. Frank's hands curled into fists. "I'll prove it," he whispered to the darkness. "I'll prove I'm American." The next morning, he returned to the sergeant. "Sir, I forgot to mention, I know about the Army. I was in high school ROTC. I know close order drill, military tactics, history. I'm not a complete novice." The sergeant's eyebrows rose. "That's so?" "Yes, sir." The sergeant studied him for a long moment, then reached into a drawer and pulled out an armband with corporal stripes. "You're going to be here a while, so I'm making you an acting corporal. Don't let it go to your head. You don't get paid like a corporal, and you're not really a corporal. But you can march the new recruits to orientation. Think you can handle that?" Frank took the armband like it was a Medal of Honor. "Yes, sir." "Good. Beats KP, doesn't it?" Frank grinned. "Yes, sir, it sure does." For 3 months, Frank marched recruits to orientation films. He saw Why We Fight 47 times. He saw the venereal disease film even more. He became an expert at left, right, left, and about face. And every night, he wondered if the FBI would ever clear him, or if he'd spend the entire war at Fort Dix, wearing fake corporal stripes and marching strangers to movie theaters. Then, in December, the sergeant called him into the office. "FBI cleared you, Cohn. You're shipping out to Fort Benning for basic training." Frank's heart leaped. "Thank you, sir." 2 weeks later, at Fort Benning, Georgia, they took him to the Middle District Court in Columbus. A judge in black robes raised his right hand. "Do you solemnly swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic?" "I do," Frank said, his voice steady and strong. "Congratulations. You are now a citizen of the United States of America." Frank walked out of that courthouse 10 feet tall. He was no longer an enemy alien. He was an American, and he was going to war. The night the training accident happened on a cold morning in February. The instructor was demonstrating gas mask procedures, and to make it more realistic, he threw what everyone thought was a smoke grenade. Frank had his gas mask on, thank God. But the grenade wasn't smoke, it was white phosphorus. The chemical fire erupted in a white-hot flash. Frank's pack ignited. His hands burned. The edges of his gas mask seared his skin. Around him men screamed and scattered. "Get it off! Get it off!" someone shrieked. Frank ripped off his burning pack and ran for the dispensary. His hands felt like they were melting. The instructor stumbled in behind him, his face a mask of blistered flesh. He'd taken the blast directly. "White phosphorus," the medic said grimly. "Get his hands in water, now!" Frank plunged his hands into a bucket, and the burning finally stopped. But the damage was done. He spent a month in the hospital. When he returned to his unit, they'd progressed from 5-mile marches to 25-mile full-gear hikes. Frank made it 15 miles before he collapsed. They loaded him into a jeep. The sergeant shook his head. "Cohn, you're not cut out for infantry." Frank wanted to argue, but his legs wouldn't stop shaking. When the 87th Infantry Division shipped out as replacements for D-Day losses, Frank was among them, not because he was ready, but because they needed bodies. He crossed the Atlantic in the hold of a transport ship, surrounded by men who would die in the hedgerows of France. Frank arrived in England, then France, then Belgium. And in Belgium, everything changed. "Cohn, you speak German, right?" an officer asked. "Yes, sir, native speaker." The officer's eyes lit up. "We're sending you to interrogation school." Frank blinked. "Sir? 2 weeks in Liège. You'll learn how to question prisoners. We need German speakers badly." Frank thought of the stormtroopers in Breslau. He thought of Uncle Herman. He thought of his grandfather, who died in a camp Frank would never see. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. "I'd be honored." At the interrogation school in Liège, Frank learned techniques he'd never imagined. How to read body language, how to exploit fear, how to make a prisoner believe you knew more than you did. "The key," the instructor said, "is control. You control the room, you control the information, you control the prisoner's hope. Make them believe cooperation is their only chance." Frank took notes in careful handwriting. Around him sat other refugee kids, Jews from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, boys who'd fled the same nightmare and now spoke the enemy's language better than the enemy himself. "We're going to win this war," one of them said during a break, "and we're going to make them answer for what they did." Frank nodded, but he didn't say what he was really thinking. That every interrogation would be personal, that every Nazi he questioned would be standing in for the men who'd killed his uncle, who'd murdered his grandfather, who'd driven his family from their home. After 2 weeks, Frank graduated and was assigned to Interrogation Prisoner of War, Team 66, IPW 66. 2 officers, 2 interpreters, a sergeant and a driver. Frank tore off his PFC stripe and wore the plain US insignia that made him look like an officer. The driver never questioned his orders. Frank didn't correct him. They rolled into Luxembourg in December 1944, attached to T-Force 12 under General Bradley. Their mission, follow the infantry into captured cities, secure intelligence targets, and interrogate high-value prisoners. 1 week later, the Germans launched their final desperate offensive through the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. The cold was inhuman. Frank sat in the back of the jeep with the windshield down. You couldn't shoot through glass, and the sleet hit his face like needles. The temperature hovered just below freezing, and the wind at 25 miles per hour turned every breath into a knife in his lungs. "This is hell," the driver muttered, his teeth chattering. "Hell's warm," Frank shot back. "This is worse." They were hunting German infiltrators, SS commandos, who'd slipped through American lines in captured jeeps, wearing stolen uniforms, speaking perfect English. They'd cut communication lines, switched road signs, and spread chaos behind the front. "If we find them, how do we know they're not real Americans?" the driver asked. The captain turned around, his face red and raw from the wind. "We ask questions only Americans would know. Baseball scores, movie stars, state capitals. And if they know the answers, then we ask harder questions." For 7 days, IPW 66 circulated through Belgium. Dinant, Namur, Rochefort, a dozen small towns whose names Frank would never remember. They stopped every jeep, questioned every soldier who looked even slightly wrong. Most were just cold, scared American kids. But in Dinant, they found one. 4 bodies lay beside a destroyed jeep, torn apart by a bazooka. An infantry roadblock had stopped them, asked for the password, and when the men couldn't answer, opened fire. Frank searched the bodies. German dog tags hidden in their boots, American dog tags around their necks, taken from prisoners or corpses. Maps marked with American positions, explosives packed in canvas bags. "Anything useful?" the captain asked. Frank shook his head. "Just confirmation. They were SS, probably Skorzeny's commandos. Bag the dog tags. We'll return them to Graves registration." Frank knelt in the snow and carefully removed the American tags from the dead Germans' necks. Somewhere, these tags belonged to real soldiers, men who died so these infiltrators could steal their identities. "I hope you bastards burned through every second of fear before that bazooka hit you," Frank whispered. On the seventh day, the offensive stalled. The Germans had pushed deep into American lines, but they couldn't break through. Fuel ran out, reinforcements never came, and the weather cleared just enough for American planes to fly again. IPW 66 received new orders. Proceed east. The infantry was advancing again, pushing toward Germany itself. "We're going into the Reich," the captain said. "Cologne first, then across the Rhine. This is what we trained for." Frank felt a strange electricity in his chest. He was going back to Germany, not as a refugee, not as a victim, as a conqueror. They crossed into Germany in early March. The city of Cologne was a moonscape of rubble, 90% destroyed by Allied bombing. The cathedral still stood, impossibly intact amid the devastation, its twin spires rising like a miracle above the ruins. "My God," the driver whispered. "We did this?" "They started it," Frank said flatly. But there were no prisoners to interrogate in Cologne. The Nazi leadership had fled across the Rhine, and the Wehrmacht had blown the bridges behind them. IPW 66 waited, restless, until the incredible news arrived. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen had been captured intact. "We're crossing," the captain said. "Get your gear." They drove across the Rhine on a bridge that swayed and groaned under the weight of tanks and trucks. German artillery pounded the far shore, trying desperately to destroy the bridge, but the shells fell wide. Frank looked down at the river, the legendary Rhine, the border of the Reich, the line Hitler had sworn would never be crossed. "We're inside," he said quietly. "We're really inside." The captain glanced back at him. "How does it feel?" Frank thought of his grandfather. He thought of Uncle Herman. He thought of his mother's face on the train to Berlin. "It feels," he said slowly, "like justice." Frankfurt fell on March 29, 1945. The city was a corpse, hollowed out by bombing, gutted by fire, its streets choked with rubble and the smell of death. But unlike Cologne, Frankfurt still had prisoners. Hundreds of them. IPW 66 set up in a commandeered building that had once been a bank. The vault became a holding cell, the lobby became an interrogation room, and Frank became very, very busy. "We need preliminary screenings on all officers," the captain said. "Separate the war criminals from the regular Wehrmacht. The criminals go to confinement. The rest go to POW camps." "How do I tell the difference?" Frank asked. "SS tattoos. Einsatzgruppen units. Anyone from concentration camp staff, anyone who held administrative positions in occupied territories. Use your judgment." Frank's judgment was sharp. He processed 20 prisoners a day, asking the same questions in the same flat tone. Name, rank, unit, service history. Where were you stationed? What were your duties? Most lied. Frank caught them every time. "You say you were a clerk in Munich," Frank said to one prisoner, "but your hands have calluses from rifle work, and your boots are Russian issue. You were on the Eastern Front, try again." The prisoner's face went pale. I was in a supply unit. We captured Russian equipment." "What unit?" The 14th Panzer Division." Frank consulted his notes. "The 14th Panzer was destroyed at Stalingrad." "You're lying. What were you really doing in Russia?" The prisoner's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Finally, he whispered, "Security operations." Frank's pen stopped moving. Security operations. That was the euphemism for mass executions, for burning villages, for killing civilians. "You're going to confinement," Frank said coldly. "Next." On April 2nd, they brought in a group of high-ranking officers captured fleeing Frankfurt. Frank was assigned to do preliminary screenings. The first officer was a colonel, arrogant, dismissive, refusing to answer questions. Frank let him stew in silence for 10 minutes, then calmly informed him that uncooperative prisoners would be transferred to Soviet custody. The colonel talked. The second officer was a major who wept and begged and insisted he'd only followed orders. Frank documented everything and sent him to the POW camp. The third officer was different. He stood at rigid attention, his uniform immaculate despite days of retreat. 2 stars on his collar, Waffen-SS insignia, a face that looked vaguely familiar, though Frank couldn't place it. "Name and rank," Frank said in German. The officer clicked his heels. "General Major August Wilhelm Prince von Preußen." Frank's pen froze mid-word. August Wilhelm, Prince of Prussia, oh my God. He knew exactly who this was. Every German schoolchild learned the royal family. August Wilhelm, nicknamed Aui, was the 4th son of Kaiser Wilhelm II. The man standing at attention in front of a Jewish PFC was royalty. Actual royalty. The son of the last German emperor, and he was SS. Frank's hand trembled slightly as he set down his pen. The prince didn't notice. He stood perfectly still, eyes forward, waiting for the next question. Frank thought of his grandfather, who died in a camp this man's organization had built. He thought of Uncle Herman, beaten to death by men wearing the same uniform this prince wore. He thought of every Jewish child who'd been murdered while German princes played at being Nazis. "Wait here," Frank said, his voice carefully neutral. He walked out of the interrogation room down the hall and into the captain's office. "Sir," Frank said quietly, "we got a big one." The captain looked up from his paperwork. "How big?" "The son of the Kaiser." The captain's eyes widened. "You're sure?" "August Wilhelm von Preußen. I recognize the name immediately. He's SS 2-star general." The captain stood up so fast his chair fell over. "Don't let him out of your sight. I'm calling this up the chain right now." Frank returned to the interrogation room. To the A. The prince still stood at attention, patient and composed, as if waiting for a servant to bring him tea. Frank sat down and looked at him, really looked at him. This man had chosen the SS, had chosen Hitler, had chosen to wear the uniform of genocide, while his family name still carried the weight of empire. "Your interrogation is over," Frank said in German. "You'll be transferred to higher authority." "I understand," the prince said calmly. 2 MPs came and led him away. Frank watched him go, walking with perfect military bearing, as if he was still royalty and not a prisoner of a Jewish refugee who'd once been driven from the prince's own country. The captain appeared in the doorway. "You okay, Cohn?" Frank realized his hands were shaking. "Yes, sir, I'm fine." "That was good work, really good work." Frank nodded, but he wasn't thinking about the praise. He was thinking about the bitter irony of it all, that a 6-year-old boy who'd fled Germany in terror had returned as a soldier, and that a prince of Prussia had stood at attention before him and answered his questions. Justice, Frank thought, sometimes has a sense of humor. But it wasn't funny, it was just sad. Sad and strange and final. The war was ending. And Frank Cohn, enemy alien turned American citizen, had played his small part in ending it. Outside, the ruins of Frankfurt smoldered in the spring rain. The road to Magdeburg was lined with ghosts. Not literal ghosts, though Frank sometimes wondered, but German soldiers who emerged from the forests with their hands up, begging to surrender. "Amerikaner! Amerikaner!" they called out, stumbling toward the jeep. The driver slowed. "Sir, should we stop?" The captain shook his head. "Keep moving. We don't have time or space for prisoners. Let the infantry units behind us handle it." Frank watched the Germans recede in the distance, their faces hollow with exhaustion and relief. They weren't trying to fight anymore. They were trying to survive. And they knew that surrender to Americans meant food, medical care, and eventual return home. Surrender to the Russians meant something else entirely. "They're terrified of the Soviets," Frank said. "Can you blame them?" The captain replied. "After what they did in Russia?" Frank couldn't. He'd heard the stories, the mass executions, the burned villages, the starvation sieges. The Germans had sown the wind in the east. Now they were reaping the whirlwind. By mid-April, IPW 66 reached the Elbe River at Magdeburg. The Americans held the western bank. The Russians held the eastern bank. And between them flowed the river that would divide Europe for the next 45 years. "Cohn, you're coming with me," the captain said suddenly. Frank looked up from his notes. "Sir? We're crossing the river. I need to talk to the Russians." Frank's stomach dropped. "Captain, I only know one word of Russian. Tovarish, that's it." The captain grinned. "I don't care. Carry the map." They commandeered a German boatman, an old man with trembling hands, who rowed them across the Elbe in a wooden boat that looked like it might sink at any moment. Halfway across, the captain stood up. "Sir, what are you doing?" Frank hissed. "Making sure they see we're American. I don't want to get shot by our own allies." The Russians saw them. And when the boat scraped against the eastern shore, the reception was unlike anything Frank had ever experienced. They swarmed the boat, laughing, shouting, pulling Frank and the captain onto the bank. They hugged them. They kissed them on both cheeks. They lifted them onto their shoulders and paraded them around like conquering heroes. "Tovarish! Tovarish!" Frank shouted, grinning despite himself. A Russian sergeant pressed a bottle of vodka into his hands. Frank took one sip and nearly choked. It burned like liquid fire. He quickly handed it back and offered cigarettes instead, which the Russians accepted with delight. The captain was whisked away to find an interpreter. Frank stayed at the river's edge, surrounded by Russian soldiers who spoke no English and seemed determined to celebrate. One young soldier, barely older than Frank, clapped him on the shoulder. "Me, Moscow," he said in broken English, pointing to himself. "Me, New York," Frank replied, pointing to himself. The Russian's face lit up. "You come Moscow. You come New York." They shook hands solemnly, as if they'd just negotiated a peace treaty. An hour later, the captain returned, smiling broadly. "Mission accomplished. Let's go." They rowed back across the Elbe. The Russians waved and shouted until the boat disappeared around a bend. That night, Frank lay in his bedroll, staring at the stars. The reception had been overwhelming, joyful, almost manic. But something about it had felt off, and he couldn't figure out what. Then, in the space between waking and sleeping, it hit him. The Russians weren't celebrating meeting Americans. They were celebrating surviving the Germans. For 3 years, the Wehrmacht had fought them with savage desperation, knowing that retreat meant the Red Army would reach Germany itself. The Germans had fought for every inch of Russian soil, and the Russians had paid for every inch in blood. But when that American uniform appeared across the river, the Russians knew the Germans had finally stopped fighting. The war was over. They had survived. Frank closed his eyes and thought of all the German soldiers who'd tried to surrender to him on the road to Magdeburg. They'd been running from the same thing the Russians were celebrating, the end of the Eastern Front. "We're all just trying to survive," Frank whispered to the darkness. But some, he knew, deserved to survive more than others. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Frank was in a commandeered hotel in Bavaria when the news came through. Men cheered and fired rifles into the air. Someone found a cache of German champagne, and the celebration lasted until dawn. Frank didn't celebrate. He sat alone in a corner, drinking coffee, thinking about his grandfather. "You okay, Cohn?" the captain asked, sitting down beside him. "Yeah," Frank said. It's over. We won. We did. You should be proud." "I am." Frank paused. "I just wish some people were here to see it." The captain nodded slowly. "I understand." But he didn't, not really. How could he? He hadn't fled Germany as a child. He hadn't lost family to the camps. He hadn't spent years wondering if he'd ever see justice. Now justice had come, but it felt hollow because the people Frank had wanted to protect were already gone. In the weeks after VE Day, IPW 66's mission shifted. They were no longer hunting war criminals, they were processing them. Thousands of SS officers, Gestapo agents and Nazi officials were being rounded up for trial. The Allies were building cases for what would become the Nuremberg trials. Frank's job was to conduct preliminary interrogations and identify high-value targets for prosecution. He was good at it. Too good. "Cohn, you'll work in 16-hour days," the captain said. "Take a break." "I'm fine, sir." "That's an order. Take a day off." Frank took a day off. He spent it reading reports about the concentration camps, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald. The photographs made him physically ill. The testimony made him want to scream. The next day, he went back to work with renewed focus. One prisoner, a former Gestapo officer, tried to play innocent. "I was just following orders. I had no choice." Frank leaned forward. "You had a choice. You chose to follow those orders. You chose to participate. And now you're going to answer for it." "I have a family," the man whispered. "Children. So did the people you killed." The man was sent to confinement to await trial. Another prisoner, an SS captain, tried to bargain. "I have information about other officers. I can give you names." "Give me the names," Frank said. The captain talked for 2 hours. Frank documented everything. When it was over, he looked the man in the eye and said, "You're still going to trial. Cooperation doesn't erase what you did." The captain's face crumbled. "But you said—" "I said I'd listen. I didn't say I'd let you go." Frank walked out of the interrogation room and didn't look back. The captain found him later, smoking a cigarette outside. "You're getting hard, Cohn." Good," Frank said. "Is it?" Frank took a long drag and exhaled slowly. "These men destroyed my country. They murdered my family. They tried to exterminate my people. And now they want mercy." He shook his head. "I'll document their crimes. I'll give them fair interrogations, but I won't give them mercy. They don't deserve it." The captain was quiet for a long moment. "Just don't lose yourself in this." "I won't," Frank said, but he wondered if he already had. In June 1945, IPW 66 was reassigned to document Nazi administrative records in preparation for the Nuremberg trials. Frank spent his days sifting through mountains of paperwork, requisition forms, transport schedules, personnel files. It was in these mundane documents that the true horror revealed itself. A requisition form for special handling of prisoners, a transport schedule for resettlement to the east, a personnel file noting an officer's exemplary service in security operations. Every euphemism was a gravestone. Frank read a memo about the efficient use of Zyklon B gas. He read a report praising a commandant for exceeding his processing quota. He read a letter from a mother asking about her son and the reply stating he had been transferred with no further information. He read until the words blurred together, until he couldn't tell if he was crying or if his eyes were just exhausted. "Cohn, go home," the captain said gently. "I'm almost done with this file. Go home. That's an order." Frank went back to his quarters and lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. He thought about the 2-star general who'd stood at attention before him. He thought about the Gestapo officer who'd begged for mercy. He thought about all the men who'd claimed they were just following orders. And he thought about the millions who died because those orders were followed. The next morning, Frank requested a transfer. "You want to leave IPW?" the captain asked, surprised. "No, sir. I want to stay in intelligence work. But I want to do something forward-looking, something that prevents this from happening again." The captain studied him. "You've done good work here, Cohn. Important work. But I understand. I'll see what I can do." 2 weeks later, Frank was reassigned to a unit documenting Nazi scientific and industrial records. Not for prosecution, but for future intelligence use. It was less emotionally draining, but no less important. He worked until his discharge in 1946, then returned to the United States with a duffel bag, a Bronze Star he never talked about, and memories he couldn't escape. His mother met him at the train station in New York. She looked older, grayer, but her eyes were the same. "You came back," she whispered, holding him tight. "I came back," Frank said. Did you find out what happened to Papa?" Frank nodded slowly. "He was sent to Theresienstadt. He died there in 1942. His mother closed her eyes. "At least we know." At least we know, Frank echoed, but knowing didn't make it hurt less. Frank Cohn built a life after the war. He went to college on the GI Bill, earned a degree, got a job, married, had children. He became an American in every sense, a citizen, a taxpayer, a voter, a father, but he never forgot. In the 1980s, when the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum was being planned, Frank volunteered. He gave testimony, he donated documents, he spoke to school groups about his experiences. "Why is this important to you?" a teacher asked him once. Frank thought carefully before answering. "Because hate doesn't just hurt the people it targets, it destroys the people who carry it. The Nazis started with hate for Jews, hate for anyone different, and that hate consumed them. It turned ordinary people into killers. It turned a civilized nation into a death machine." He paused, looking at the students. "I interrogated dozens of Nazi officers. You know what most of them said? I was just following orders. I didn't have a choice. Everyone else was doing it. They'd convinced themselves they weren't responsible, but they were. Every single one of them made a choice." A student raised her hand. "What choice?" "The choice to hate," Frank said simply. "The choice to dehumanize, the choice to follow orders they knew were wrong. And once they made that choice, it became easier to make it again and again, until murder became routine." Another student asked, "How do we stop it from happening again?" Frank smiled sadly. "You recognize hate when you see it. You speak up against it. You refuse to let it become normal. Because hate always starts small, a joke, a slur, a stereotype, but if you let it grow, it becomes something monstrous." He looked around the room. "I owed America everything. This country took me in when I had nothing. It gave me citizenship, opportunity, a future. So this is my payback, telling you what I saw, so you'll recognize it if it ever comes back." The students were silent. "I hope you never have to fight a war like I did," Frank continued. "But if hate ever rises again, I hope you'll fight it. Not with guns, with words, with votes, with courage. That's how you honor the people who didn't survive." After the talk, a young girl approached him. "Mr. Cohn, were you scared when you interrogated those Nazi generals?" Frank thought about the two-star SS general standing at attention before him. He thought about his trembling hands, his racing heart, the bitter irony of a Jewish refugee questioning German royalty. "Yes," he said honestly, "I was terrified. But I did it anyway, because sometimes being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means being scared and doing what's right anyway." The girl nodded solemnly. "Thank you for being brave." Frank's eyes stung. "Thank you for listening." In 2024, at 98 years old, Frank Cohn still volunteers at the Holocaust Memorial Museum. His hands shake now, and his voice is softer, but his memory is sharp as ever. "People ask me why I keep doing this," he says to a new group of visitors. "I'm 98. I've earned my rest, but I can't rest. Not while there are people who deny the Holocaust happened. Not while there are people who think hate is acceptable. Not while there are people who need to hear this story." He pauses, looking at the faces before him, young and old, from dozens of countries, speaking dozens of languages. "I was 6 years old when I learned that Nazis were my enemy. I was 18 when I became an American citizen. I was 20 when I interrogated the son of the German Kaiser. And I'm 98 now, telling you this story." His voice grows stronger. "The Holocaust happened. I saw the documents. I questioned the perpetrators. I heard their excuses. And I'm here to tell you, never again. Never again can we let hate consume us. Never again can we stand by while people are dehumanized. Never again can we say, 'I was just following orders.'" He looks directly at the camera, recording his testimony. "I won't be here forever, but this story will. And I hope, I pray, that it makes a difference, that it stops someone from choosing hate, that it inspires someone to choose courage instead." Frank Cohn smiles, and for a moment he looks like the young soldier who crossed the Rhine into Germany, carrying justice in his heart and trembling hands. "That's my mission," he says quietly. "That's my payback to America." And I'll keep doing it as long as I have breath in my body. The camera stops recording. The visitors applaud. And Frank Cohn, enemy alien turned American hero, sits back in his chair and closes his eyes, remembering a 6-year-old boy in Breslau who learned what hate could do, and a 20-year-old soldier in Frankfurt who learned what justice could look like, and a 98-year-old man in Washington who learned that some stories must never be forgotten.